Verlen Kruger, a plumbing contractor from DeWitt, Michigan, 49 years old and a solid family man with 9 children. Clint Waddell, a U.S. Forestry Service biologist from St. Paul, Minnesota, 36 years old and a bachelor. But these 2 men had one abiding interest in common: the thrill of canoeing wilderness waters. Clint and Verlen first teamed up for a professional canoe race back in 1966. In '68, they made a record-breaking endurance run of 250 miles in 81 hours from International Falls, Minnesota to Grand Portage on Lake Superior. But now, they are to undertake an incredible challenge, never before attempted by 2 men in a canoe. Clint and Verlen had long been intrigued by the history of the French-Canadian voyageurs. These early trappers, traders, and explorers used canoes as the sole means of penetrating the Canadian wilderness. Each spring, large Montreal canoes like this, each carrying as much as 3 tons, plus crew and supplies, would leave Montreal for an 8-week journey to the settlement of Grand Portage on a shallow bay of Lake Superior. There they would rendezvous with the smaller north canoes used by the trappers to return from their winter trapping grounds. These would be loaded primarily with beaver pelts, then in great demand in the fashion centers of Europe. The smaller north canoes were ideally suited to the swift waters of rivers such as the Athabasca. The flotillas of Montreal and north canoes would meet at Grand Portage in late June, and the rendezvous would last a full month. There would be storytelling and shooting matches, canoe races, and of course, trading. The trappers would trade their beaver pelts for the wares brought up from Montreal: guns, ammunition, cloth, tools, traps, and food to vary their wilderness diets. Not to mention tobacco and spirited beverages, and trade goods for the Indians. It's an historical fact that by the mid-1700s, these trappers and traders had worked out a transportation system which spanned over 3,000 miles of Canadian waters, from Montreal to the tiny settlement of Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. They accomplished this with the birch bark canoe as their only vehicle. There were no roads other than game trails, and so the rivers and lakes were the highways of the wilderness, and canoes were the cars and trucks. Small trading posts were established at key points throughout this transportation network, but the big business of the year was transacted at the rendezvous, the midway point in that wilderness network. And each canoe brigade traveled 3,000 miles in getting to that rendezvous, and then back to their starting points in the course of some 4 months. But there's no record anywhere of anyone taking a canoe completely across the continent and up to the Bering Sea in one trip, from spring to fall. Could the voyageurs have done it? Could anyone do it? Clint and Verlen found themselves asking that question with ever-increasing fascination. Could they make a trip that not even the voyageurs had attempted? True, it was now 300 years since the days when Montreal was just a village. But much of the route is still virtually unchanged from the time of the voyageurs. Clint and Verlen had no choice. They just had to give it a go. This is the challenge they face: to traverse this continent by canoe through some of the wildest country it contains. They decided to leave Montreal in mid-April, just after the spring thaw, when the river ice would be breaking up. They would head upstream on the St. Lawrence River, transfer to the Ottawa River, and head across the northern shore of Lake Huron. Portaging the Sioux Locks, the two would cross the northern shore of Lake Superior, 470-some miles into the boundary waters of Minnesota. Then paddle across rugged Lake Winnipeg to the Churchill River chain of lakes and into the Clearwater River of the Arctic watershed. From there, down the Athabasca River across the west end of Lake Athabasca to Fort Chipewyan. That's where the main fur trade route ended. But Kruger and Waddell were going farther yet. They would take their canoe down the treacherous Slave River through the Great Slave Lake to reach the majestic Mackenzie River, which was discovered by explorer Sir Alexander Mackenzie in 1789. Then travel the twisted, shallow waters of the Rat River and labor up the steep climb to the McDougall Pass of the Richardson Mountains, the northern end of the Rockies. After crossing Summit Lake on top of the mountains, they would join up with the Yukon River in Alaska, a mere 1,200 miles from the Bering Sea. A newspaper account of this unbelievable endeavor fails to mention Verlen Kruger's 3 years of meticulous research. He read literally every appropriate book written, even going so far as to obtain microfilm copies of the journal kept by Alexander Mackenzie. Kruger designed and built the 21-foot-long, 110-pound fiberglass Sitka spruce canoe, and he used sections of a pole vaulter's pole as shafts for the specially built paddle blades. The enormity of this voyage almost defies comprehension. If they were to travel the same distance in the United States, they would begin in New York and paddle straight across America to California, then turn around and paddle back to New York, and then again paddle back to California, over 7,000 miles. As they pull away from land, Kruger knows that battling the natural elements will be only a part of the challenge. His extensive research has shown that psychological tension is always a greater threat than wind, weather, or stream conditions. Other attempts of this magnitude failed when the paddlers could no longer tolerate the close presence of each other for days, weeks, and months on end. The immediate problem, however, is ice. For the last 94 years, the St. Lawrence River has usually been free of ice by the 10th of April. It is now April 17th, but the river is still frozen, with about a foot of slush on top of the ice. It is impossible to walk through it or slide the canoe over it. After testing the ice, Verlen thinks the only solution is to portage. You can see that Clint is thrilled to death about that. To carry canoe and all gear over land to open water. Since they have no choice, it's full speed astern as the search for the portage begins. Clint had trained for portaging by gathering 200 pounds of neighborhood children and carrying them on his back for hours. Verlen had spent the winter carrying the canoe around a 2-mile course in DeWitt, Michigan. But they'd not expected to be portaging so soon. Verlen's reactions are recorded in his diary.
I never in my wildest imagination figured on portaging 30 or 40 or 50 miles right out of town, right up the river. I find it hard to believe myself that this is a canoe trip.
The men are carrying approximately 170 pounds each, and they will carry those loads 47 miles on this portage alone. Putting the canoe down by open water 4 days later is more than just mild relief, and Verlen records his reactions.
Man, oh man, you have to do it to understand the thrill and joy of putting that canoe down after hours and hours of sweat and pain. That's one of the supreme joys of the trip. You know what's funny? We look forward to getting out of the canoe to make a portage, but after the portage, nothing was better than getting back into the canoe.
Verlen and Clint use the standard canoe racer's paddle stroke, 50 to 55 per minute. But even these powerful racing strokes require efficient hull design for best results. Verlen's design assures a maximum glide with each stroke of the special paddles. Now, should they complete their epic journey, these paddles will pull through Canadian waters more than 5 million times. As they thread their way through oncoming chunks of ice, the feeling is one of anxiety laced with exhilaration. Priorities change rapidly when man faces nature. Gasoline prices and credit cards and tax forms become pretty hollow words when a man feels himself once more the captain of his soul. Heroism flows from the successful meeting of challenges within challenges, and you're watching a plumber and a biologist challenge history. You see two men in a homemade canoe, two men whose teamwork approaches the grace of a ballet, and whose courage tells you that they need never fear that they may cease to be. The next 3 days, the two paddle over 30 miles a day against the brisk current of the Ottawa River before they pass by the Canadian Parliament buildings in the city of Ottawa. Did some desk-bound bureaucrat, I wonder, spot them from a window and say, "Look at those two nuts in the canoe down there"? And if so, what would he have said if he had known what they were setting out to accomplish? But for now, the paddling is halted again. There are still many more miles of back-breaking, monotonous portaging through the busy streets of Canada's capital. In a series of cannon-like roars, spring comes to the Canadian waters, and the ice breaks up in the Ottawa River. As usual, opportunity is coupled with danger. The current alone at nearly 5 miles an hour against them would be bad enough. Add the hazard of floating ice, and matters get much worse. As the river roars by them, the weight and size of the canoe actually begins to put a curve in Verlen Kruger's back on the long portages. As he wrote in his diary,
"So great was the weight of the canoe on these long days that when I would lie on my back to rest, it would take 5 minutes before my cramped muscles could relax enough to let my head and my heels touch the ground at the same time. The pain was something to remember."
But the portaging goes on as they search for a place that will enable them to put the canoe in the water and get out into the river. With the exception of hydroelectric dams like this, much of the route taken by the Voyageurs remains virtually unchanged after hundreds of years. Many Canadians are keenly aware of their historical heritage and realize that these same rivers and elements confronted the Voyageurs in their quest for more and more furs. On April 30th, the two go ashore at the confluence of the Ottawa and Matawa rivers, 13 days after their departure from Lachine. Though they set out as two men trying to conquer a continent, they realize that it, in its own way, is conquering them. The Voyageur mystique has begun to work its subtle magic. Verlen works on his diary as they stop in Champlain Provincial Park for several days. Again, the lake ahead of them is frozen. Clint leaves, beginning a pattern of deliberate separation at the noon meal, designed to alleviate as much as possible any tension building up between them. His explorations lead him to another link with the past, a beaver pond. The beaver became the rage of European hatters centuries ago because of a unique quality of its pelt. The hair of the beaver is minutely barbed. When put under pressure in the felting process and stiffened with shellac, it could be molded into any shape required by the hat fashions of the day. Though demand for the beaver pelts has never again approached that of the 17 and 1800s, there's still a brisk trade in the skins, and people like Andy Green here, repositories of both a trade and a cultural heritage at the same time, have no trouble at all selling a properly prepared pelt. And here Andy's heritage serves him well, for the baiting and placing of traps is all important, and no matter to be left to an amateur. When Andy catches a beaver, he prepares the hide for market by stretching it on this old Indian invention, a Cree hoop. Over $3 million worth of beaver pelts are still taken out of the province of Ontario each year. A pelt of this size and quality will bring Andy Green about $50 at one of the many fur auctions in Canada. Here, Verlen and Clint touch the fascinating Voyageur past again in the person of Charlie Labarge, the chief ranger at the park. Charlie is a descendant of one of the original French-Canadian voyageurs, and he keeps his heritage alive by building birch bark canoes, the same way they were built back in the 1700s. The black lines on this model canoe show where the birch bark has been caulked with spruce and pine gum to prevent leaking. A large Montreal canoe carried a fantastic payload of 4 tons, all in a fragile birch bark skin. Early in the spring, Charlie finds a large birch bark tree. Just as you see him doing here, carefully removes the bark. Incidentally, this doesn't harm or kill the tree. The Indians made the first birch bark canoes and constructed them without using any metal or steel tools. Eric Morse, a well-known Canadian author and fur trade historian, claims that each canoe carried its spare parts, extra bark, gum, and cedar or spruce roots in a roll of birch bark like this. Alexander Mackenzie's journal of Friday, July 28, 1793, recounts the same problems that faced Charlie Labarge and his helpers. Mackenzie must build a canoe, and men are dispatched to gather the necessary materials.
At a very early hour of the morning,
Mackenzie wrote,
every man was employed in making preparations for building another canoe, and different parties went in search of birch bark, roots, and gum.
Charlie Labarge will use the same materials. The roots of a spruce tree will be treated to make them soft and pliable. Charlie gathers pitch, or gum, from spruce trees, which is used to plug up the many small holes in the canoe. It takes Charlie and his helper nearly 300 hours of painstaking work to build a 16-foot-long canoe. Like many before it, this one may find itself gracing one of Canada's many fine museums. Charlie explains to Clint and Verlen that his motivation to build these canoes is a purely historical one. Charlie says that perhaps someone from a future generation may see one of his canoes in a museum and possibly gain a little insight into his heritage. After several days of rain, portages along the rocky and rugged Matawa River are wet and muddy. But in keeping with the spirit of their trip, they accept no help from anyone, use no motors or tow vehicles, and whenever possible, they single portage all their gear. This means just one trip, hauling everything at once. In this case, however, the rugged terrain forced them to make 2 trips, or double portage. And now it's time to leave. And it's evident Charlie would like to go along with them, but it's only a 2-man canoe. So they paddle on, sometimes going faster backwards than forward, since in spots the current is nearly 15 miles an hour against them. Even the river bank itself often functions as a history book. Verlen and Clint slow down as they pass this cave. Early voyageurs were very superstitious, and they believed the devil himself lurked in this sinister-looking den on the Matawa River. They would paddle past it as quickly as they could manage, giving the shoreline a mighty wide berth. Clint and Verlen struggle upstream, and an ominous roar tells them that another portage is at hand. The source of that roar tells them why. As the paddlers push farther into Canada's wilderness, the terrain becomes more ruggedly beautiful. This is the same scenery that greeted Samuel de Champlain more than 3.5 centuries ago. But now it's time to portage again. Clint and Verlen decide to take a look at what lies ahead. Every explorer, voyageur, or missionary who canoed up into the Great Lakes area had to portage here. The rocks are worn smooth from many years of usage, and they prove that Verlen and Clint are on the fur route trail. Below, the rapids, and Clint says that the 2 can't paddle through them. They must portage. Verlen wonders. He thinks maybe they can make it. Clint's answer? No way. They hike back down to their canoe for the inevitable portage. Yep, tote that canoe, Verlen. This time the slippery rocks make it impossible for one man to carry the canoe by himself, and so they double haul their gear. Paddling with the synchronized grace of true professionals, Clint and Verlen resume their quest in beautiful weather. You'd have to feel the power of your own arms pulling the canoe, hear the lapping of the water against the hull, and share the feeling that you belong exactly where you are to know what this voyage means to these men. Before it's over, exhilaration will become mixed with great physical pain. On more than one occasion, they will paddle all night, and at least 6 times they will paddle a minimum of 40 consecutive hours stopping only for meals and 10-minute rest breaks. On May 7th, they've cleared the last of the ice. Traveling an average of 50 miles a day, hugging the icy north shore of Lake Huron, Verlen and Clint reach Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan on Tuesday, May 11th, and find themselves racing this big black canoe. They lose the race with this big canoe, but it's good comic relief and very welcome relief. Let's try that racing stroke again with some special secret additives. And there it is, the miracle elixir. Now we'll race that big black canoe again. Bering Sea, here we come. Verlen and Clint use the Waddell on this portage, and they seem almost desperate to get somewhere important, especially Clint, who begins portaging with unusual haste ahead of Verlen. Now there, folks, is the stride of a man with a mission. You'll be relieved to know that Verlen didn't portage through the lobby. Now they head for one of the most perilous and unpredictable portions of their long canoe safari, the cold, dangerous waters of Lake Superior. Verlen and Clint talk with many people at the Sioux Locks, and no one can tell them how to canoe across Lake Superior. They make the trip anyway, battling fog, wind, and waves, some 470 miles in 14 days. Grand Portage. It was the original site of the annual Traders' and Trappers' Rendezvous. But after the War of 1812, the Northwest Fur Company decided to move the site 50 miles north to Fort Williams. The loaded Montreal canoe had only 6 inches of birch bark from its top edge to the water, as in this modern reenactment. The man guiding in the stern, where you can see the flag of the Northwest Fur Company flying, was the gouvernail. His counterpart in the bow was the avant, and each was responsible for steering the canoe. These two men had paddles of 7 to 9 feet long, while the milieu, or paddlers sitting close to the water line in the middle of the canoe, had short, narrow paddles designed to push off the rocks and aid in beaching as well as paddling. In addition to traditional Voyageur costumes, those reenacting the move recreate a more personal aspect of the Voyageur past. They're thirsty, and so it's time to tap a keg of liquid history. Voyageur High Wine, a Burgundy concoction welcomed by all, in tin cups or even in a yellow plastic bucket that's obviously historically inaccurate, but shared by everybody just the same.
Words cannot describe the beauty of an early morning mist. The waters assume an intimacy that seems to make time itself stand still, and only the feeling of the mist on his face reminds a man that he is still a creature of this earth.
The big Montreal canoes were equipped with sails to take advantage of favorable winds on open waters. And the Canadians, reenacting the historic move, like their Voyageur predecessors, proved themselves quite adept at converting the elements to their own advantage. The Canadian government is rebuilding old Fort Williams as an historical site near Thunder Bay. And our modern-day Voyageurs are bringing, among other things, a Northwest Fur Company flag to the celebration. Beams for the reconstruction are brought ashore from their canoes by the reenactment party. Prime Minister Davis of the province of Ontario is among the notables gathered to commemorate that occasion. The colorful costumes of the Highlander Band and the traditional anthems by the pipers underscore the significance of the reenactment. The ceremony concludes with the flag of the Northwest Fur Company flying once again above historic Fort Williams. Meanwhile, back at Grand Portage, Clint and Verlen have arrived. They portage right along. 9 miles through the Indian village and past another 20 miles of rapids and falls near the mouth of the Pigeon River. With spring fully arrived, nature provides some tasty supplements to Voyageur rations. These spring morels, or mushrooms if you prefer, are delicious with just about anything. On Friday, May 28th, Verlen and Clint set up camp near Partridge Falls. There isn't any room service, but there is cold running water, and Clint uses it to quiet his barking dogs. Verlen, sporting his growing beard, repacks their gear, disposing of all tin cans. They're about to enter international boundary waters where no tin cans are allowed. "40 miles beyond Partridge Falls is Height of Land, one of the highest points above sea level on the Voyageur route. Here, Clint and Verlen observe the ancient Voyageur ritual of sprinkling each other with branches and promising never to kiss the other man's wife without her permission. Even in situations like these, the Voyageur past cannot be avoided, for our two canoeists have literally baptized themselves with history. As they spend days on the Voyageur trail, the feeling that they belong to the country and the country to them grows accordingly. They're slowly becoming voyageurs themselves. With the current now briefly in their favor, they travel deeper into international boundary waters, a sanctuary for wildlife, including that endangered species, the American bald eagle. These magnificent birds nest and thrive in this highly protected area. The pursuit of this animal literally opened up the Northwest. For the beaver, by never migrating and by building elaborate lodges, guaranteed his own destruction. When the white man brought iron, steel, and guns to replace the Indians' wood, rocks, and arrows, the beaver, limited to his little pond and highly visible house, could be destroyed at will. When the dams were broken to drain the ponds, and the lodges hacked apart with hatchets, there was no escape. As the population decreased, the fur seekers had to go farther into the territory to find new beaver ponds, and exploration thus advanced. Since the beaver finds his food primarily by swimming to look for it, he builds dams and backs up larger ponds to make his search easier. This makes the moose, who then has a larger pond bottom to feed on, his natural neighbor. When the beaver dams fell victim to the axes of the trappers, the food supply of the moose was also depleted, again revealing the delicate balance of nature. The moose eats the grass around the beaver pond, and his trip into the pond has a twofold purpose. It will enable him to shake himself free of pesky flies, but more importantly, it'll give him access to the water plants on the bottom of the pond. And these plants are an important item on his summer menu. The The race with time now intensifies, and subtle tensions between the two canoeists begin to mount slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Bering Sea is still more than 6,000 miles ahead, and the only way to get there is to keep on going. The big question remains, can they make it before freeze-up stops them cold? Verlen and Clint now find themselves taking greater chances on the many rapids they encounter. The almost magnetic force of the swirling white water challenges them to try, disregarding their second thoughts to Portage. Well, after a rough stretch of water like that, a fella's entitled to a little break, right? On June 4th, they portage through International Falls in northern Minnesota. Most natives try very hard to ignore two bearded men walking down the main street carrying a canoe and a lot of other gear. From International Falls, the route leads through Lake Winnipeg to Flin. Every inch on the map represents days of hard paddling. No one can keep working that hard without some kind of a break now and then. Clint and Verlen find recreation readily available, since both enjoy fishing. And the fishing is great just about any place they try. Walleye pike are both plentiful and cooperative. They're also delicious, of course. Verlen paddles to shore and begins a fire as Clint fishes upstream. Verlen is usually in charge of the cooking chores. Catching fish from clean, fresh waters and eating them on the spot is another one of the real pleasures of their trip. As always, they bow their heads and return thanks to their God for the meal and their continuing good fortune. Farther up into Manitoba head our modern voyageurs. Verlen and Clint decide on a longer break from their journey. A few days off in Flin, Manitoba might be just what they need. Flin, named after a cartoon character, is the home of the world's largest copper zinc smelter works. This smelter runs full blast 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and as long as it runs, these smokestacks belch their clouds of ugly gray grunge. Flin calls this the Trout Festival. But our voyageurs say this is the only trout they saw all week. Verlen's family has come from DeWitt to visit him because from this point on, there will be little opportunity. Ahead lie thousands of miles of virtually untouched timberland and an unbelievable chain of events. And Verlen will soon discover that Clint feels a growing resentment against any delay in the trip. Everybody shows up for festival time, and everybody enjoys the amateur canoe race. You can tell they're amateurs because they all want to paddle in the same piece of water, or not at all. Meanwhile, our voyageurs stopped to watch a little dance number called the Arctic Red Jig. It's sort of a combination of the Highland Fling, the turkey trot, the twist, and a good old-fashioned hot foot. Henry here has been first place winner for the past 7 or 8 years. The band on this man's forehead is called a tump line. Now, these sacks of flour are tied with leather straps, and all of the straps are hooked to the band around his head. He's carrying 850 pounds of flour and must carry it for 50 feet in order to win, which he does. The prize is uniquely appropriate. He wins all the sacks of flour he's carried over the line. The people of Flin, Flon are pretty excited. It's time for their first annual rodeo. And like all wilderness events, it's pretty wild. There's Henry teaching the clown how to do the Arctic Red Jig. Maybe this horse took lessons from Henry, too. Whoops. Looks like one of the cowpunchers got punched out. But Henry gets an idea. He says, "I'll ride that mean old bull." And he does, too, for 2 whole seconds. Old Henry took the cure that day. That was just too much bull for Henry. But you can't keep a good man down. Clint and Verlen had stopped for a break. Time off. Relaxation, right? Wrong. Now they enter a 3-day canoe race. On July 9th, some of the best professional canoe racing teams from the U.S. and Canada weigh in and measure canoes to meet Canadian racing specification. This race, a cross-country marathon, is one of the largest and toughest on the continent. There's the gun, and 36 madmen begin a mad scramble for a share of the $3,000 purse. Verlen calls it the challenge within the challenge. It was the physical preparation for professional racing that put them in shape for the arduous trip toward the Bering Sea. In a red canoe, they are designated Team Number 2. They do as well on land as in the water, often gaining precious ground during the portages. Jenny and the family have brought a specially designed racing canoe from home that Verlen built during the winter. Prior to the race, he and Clint trained for hours to familiarize themselves with the new canoe and with the course itself. Although similar in design, the racing canoe is 2.5 feet shorter, weighs 50 pounds less than the 110-pound canoe they're using for their trip. The heavier canoe has altered the rhythm of their strokes, and now in this lighter one, a synchronization so necessary to professionals seems to elude them. All of the canoes in the race are homemade, and Verlen and Clint are stroking well here, but still in 10th place. As the race wears on, the physical conditioning produced by over 2,300 miles of canoeing begins to show. Stamina and endurance become all important. Team number 15, the professional champions of the province of Alberta, initially had a large lead over Clint and Verlen. But after 6 hours, things have obviously changed. And the Alberta champions now trailed them. As Verlen and Clint finish the first day of the race, they've moved into 6th place. The second day brings more of the same. The beginning sprint at 75 strokes per minute, which eventually diminishes to one long, hard stroke every second. On the third day, they're back at it again. There are fewer portages in the last 2 legs of the 3-day race, and Clint and Verlen managed to move from 6th to 5th. At the end of the race, this Quebec team takes the $1,000 first prize and a beautiful trophy. Verlen and Clint hold their 5th place spot and collect $200 for their efforts. When the officials learn the 2 voyageurs are putting back into the water for a 4,500-mile jaunt to Alaska, you can just figure what they said. You don't have to be crazy to do something like that, but it sure must help a lot. It's time to trade this red racing canoe in for the familiar long green model. There's a lot of water between them and the Bering Sea, and only 3 months of traveling weather remain. Just above Flin, Flon, is the Churchill River country, a panorama of lakes and connecting waterways. Civilization is limited to occasional Indian villages, and the nature of the trip changes again. Behind schedule, Verlen and Clint start pushing themselves even harder than before. They now think that traveling 50 miles a day is a significant accomplishment. Little do they suspect that later they will have to travel nearly twice that every day for weeks at a time. The days have worn on into midsummer, and there are 4,500 miles yet to go. Half of the anticipated ice-free time has elapsed, but 2/3 of the distance remains to be covered. The question, can they make it before freeze-up, is still unanswered. Before they began their journey, Verlen and Clint deposited $500 at the Hudson Bay Company's main post in Winnipeg. And as they stop at remote villages in their push northwards, they will carry their letter of credit as purchasing power. Pelican Narrows is truly a place of contrast. New prefab houses and timeless hand-built log cabins nestle side by side. The water at Pelican Narrows is always cold, and how these Indian lads could ever swim in it was beyond Clint. The Churchill River, in the journals of the earliest travelers to these waters, stands out as one of the best to canoe on. Meathie Portage is a 12-mile portage across a low, sandy ridge with a mile-long lake at the northern end. In crossing this height of land, Clint and Verlen enter the Arctic watershed by way of the Clearwater River. Verlen and Clint find that they are not alone. Millions of black flies have tagged along. Verlen learns you should never kill a black fly. If you do, 1,000,000 other flies come to its funeral. On the morning of July 26th, our portaging voyageurs run into a group of archaeology students on a summer research project. These paths go back perhaps 10,000 years to the late Ice Age and the coming of the Indian to the North American continent. This piece of flint came from a flintlock rifle. They find these rat canoes used for muskrat trapping on the banks of the Clearwater River. After an exhausting 100-mile marathon, after tangling with the best paddlers in the U.S. and Canada, after paddling thousands of miles themselves, what do they do for rest and relaxation? Race canoes, of course. Here Clint jumps the gun and Verlen never does catch him. Waddell wins going away. But it's time to get back in that big green canoe again and head northwards. Here we see a carbon copy of Ernest Hemingway in the bow. And downriver, a little later, Hemingway in the bow chauffeurs none other than Rip Van Winkle in the stern. They experiment constantly with their diets, eating nothing but meat for 1 week and only canned vegetables and fruits for another, with a week of porridge, soups, and raisins after that. But it was pancakes that won. Laced with cornmeal, wheat germ, powdered milk, and powdered eggs, one pancake was good for 5 miles on the water, and only 7 pancakes could sustain the paddlers for 7 hours between meals without a stop. When Clint latches onto this mammoth northern pike, the two discuss long and hard as to who should have the honor of cleaning it. For the sake of Christian charity, the name of the appointed butcher will remain anonymous. But this is all that's left of 35 pounds of northern pike. It is now late July and the weather's turning cooler already. Some 3,000 miles are now behind them, and yet they have over 4,000 miles left to go. One of the first stops on the swift Athabasca is Fort McMurray. 10 years before their visit, Fort McMurray was a village of 2,000 people. Today, thanks to an oil refining complex, the population has tripled to 7,500. The first European voyager here was Peter Pond. The wilderness is giving way to condominiums, office buildings, new homes, and the growth is amazing. The earth seems no match for modern construction equipment. Clint and Verlen stop briefly for a look at the oil-saturated tar sand that has lured technology northward. Some may quarrel about the relationship between wilderness and so-called progress. In his book, Green Hills of Africa, Ernest Hemingway said, "A continent ages quickly when we come. The natives live in harmony with it. The earth gets tired of being exploited. A country wears out quickly unless man puts back in it all his residue and that of all his beasts. When he quits using beasts and uses machines, the earth defeats him quickly. The machine can't reproduce, nor does it fertilize the soil, and it eats what he cannot raise. A country was made to be as we found it. We are the intruders, and after we're dead, we may have ruined it, but it will still be there. And we don't know what the next changes are." From Fort McMurray, Verlen and Clint follow the Athabasca River to Fort Chipewyan. the northern end of the early traders' main route, but hardly the halfway point for our modern voyageurs. They walk into Fort Chippewayn to check on the mail that had been forwarded to them, only to find that it hasn't arrived yet. Later, they meet a direct descendant of Simon Fraser, a famous early explorer. This man has Fraser's set of bagpipes, his tobacco pouch, and carved pipe, artifacts which any Canadian museum would love to have on display. The workmanship on the tobacco pouch and the pipe reveals the great care taken by native craftsmen, and the reverence with which they are handled shows what they mean to their owner. But they couldn't stop anywhere for long now, not with so far to go and so little of the summer remaining. They step up the tempo of their paddling, making as much as 60 or 70 miles on a good day. Their muscles have long since hardened to the strain of long pulls with a minimum of rest. Their determination to reach the Bering Sea before freeze-up has grown stronger as well. But it's still a race against time, and time is getting short. Along the way, the two meet William Lett, another Voyageur descendant. And it's here that they are introduced to dried fish. Properly prepared and dried, they'll keep for some time. Since they're now boneless, they can be eaten quickly, even while paddling a canoe. These whitefish comprise afternoon snacks from here till the end of their trip. That's not bad snacking at $3 for $1. Clint decides they'd make pretty nifty Halloween masks, too.
But this country has many masks. Powerful rapids can pull our canoe every which way in spite of our efforts to control it. Yet, those rapids can quickly lead to a pond so placid that it wouldn't even ruffle the feathers of the local Arctic loon.
Hey, Mom, there's a funny animal over there on the water. Don't bother me, son. Can't you see I'm busy? Honest, Mom, it's really weird, like the picture in the library. What's it look like, son? Well, it's got a long green body, a paddle on each side, a head in the back, and a head in the front. Please, son, we bears are still suffering from the unbearable publicity surrounding that dizzy Goldilocks and those 3 crummy bowls of porridge. But, Mom, the front head just smiled at me. I know Yogi would say grin and bear it, but we're getting out of here. Verlen and Clint travel up the Slave River on their way to the Great Slave Lake and stop just outside Fort Fitzgerald. Ahead of them lies one of the most challenging parts of their journey. Between Fort Smith and Fort Fitzgerald are 18 miles of treacherous rapids. One in particular. It's named the Rapids of the Drowned. Here's what Verlen notes in his diary for August 15th.
Most people take their canoes out of the water here and travel by road to Fort Smith beyond the rapids. But we refused to accept help of any kind, so trucks were out of the question. We wanted to follow the exact same route Sir Alexander Mackenzie took. At the Rapids of the Drowned, we approached to the extreme right and paddled through some preliminary fast water past the first set of islands. Then, around a sharp bend of fast water to the extreme right channel, to a point where we could see straight ahead to the end of the channel. There was a narrow chute of rapids and falls. We portaged on the flat, rocky shoreline, not too far, but not too easy. And at the end of the chute, we were through. We made it through the granddaddy of all rapids, and and it had been anything but dull. We did what very few men had ever done, and to hear some tell it, it couldn't be done.
At Hay River, Verlen writes,
Jenny flew up to Fort Smith for 3 days, and Clint thought this delay was unnecessary. I tried to explain to him that Jenny really needed my help and moral support. She was alone with 7 teenagers, one graduating from high school, another getting married, and there were many other problems at home. Add to this the psychological stigma of explaining the absence of an irresponsible husband, and you have a slight idea of what she was going through. I tried to explain to Clint that with our strong feelings for each other, it was important to me that she not get any bad feelings about this trip because of my neglect. She's been wonderful about this whole thing, and my first love, as always, is for her.
with supplies bought in Hay River, they push on, paddling 120 miles in one agonizingly long day of 40 consecutive hours. It's August 17th, and summer is waning. Verlen writes,
There seems to be a sort of feel of preliminary fall in the air. The weather is a little cooler, and the geese are flying south.
Now checking their map, they agree to make their next major stop in Arctic Red River, nearly 1,000 miles northward. Fall arrives on the Mackenzie River. They are racing the season. Alexander Mackenzie's journal describes the Yukon autumn.
The most beautiful scenery I had ever beheld. This magnificent theater of nature has all the decorations which trees and animals of the country can afford it. The whole country displayed an exuberant verdure. The trees of bare blossom were advancing fast to that delightful appearance, and the velvet rind of their branches, reflecting the oblique rays of the sun, added a splendid gaiety to the scene which no expressions of mine are qualified to describe.
But winter is on its way. They reach Arctic Red River 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle on August 29th. They've traveled 1,000 miles north in 11 days. That's an average of over 90 miles of paddling every day. They're camped with Tony Mercredi, the guide for photographer Phil Pemberton. Mercredi tries to explain that their chances are not good now and are worsening daily. Our paddlers plan to travel down the Mackenzie River for about 30 miles northwards and across the Husky Channel to the south branch of the Rat River. They will follow the Rat through a tricky maze of multiple channels, through the Richardson Mountains to Summit Lake, nestled high in the McDougall Pass. Here at Arctic Red River, they find further evidence of the importance of oil in today's world. Just across the river, construction crews are pushing the Dempster Highway toward the new oil fields in Mackenzie Delta. The inhabitants of Arctic Red River Village are primarily Indians. While they still live a rather primitive life, the snowmobile is starting to replace the sled dog. The coming of the construction crews will undoubtedly increase the impact of change on their lifestyle. For now, however, village life revolves around the fish camp, for fish is an important staple on the native diet. There's the usual complement of kids and dogs, of course. They are the one constant factor in any community of these Northlands. The dogs are huskies or malamutes with thick, furry coats to protect against the fierce winters. And the fish caught and dried during the summer months keep them alive all winter, too. Mama Bluecoat has been filleting fish for drying in this camp for 50-some years. And she doesn't really give a hoot about oil in the Mackenzie Delta. All she knows is that dried fish make up 50% of her family's diet throughout the winter. And that's important. If you were to give this sled dog team a vote, they would undoubtedly agree with Mama Bluecoat. Verlen and Clint buy more supplies and head down the Mackenzie River towards the McDougall Pass, some 200 miles away. Soon they will leave the wide and beautiful Mackenzie to go up a river whose name should tell you something about it: the Rat. It's impossible to say enough bad things about the Rat River. Since it's narrow, it's extremely fast, but also quite shallow and often requires that the canoe be towed by lines from the shore. The shore itself is alternately rocky, then brushy, then steep cliffs.
Absolutely nothing could have prepared us for what happened on the Rat River. Swollen by days of rain, the Rat was rising over a foot every 6 hours and would soon fill the narrow canyon from cliff to cliff. We pitched camp in the rain again. Too rocky to use tent stakes, so we fashioned some stakes and poles out of branches. And finally, we had to tie some lines to bushes. 54 miles of rapids between us and the McDougall Pass, all upstream through undergrowth that made portaging impossible. Too much current to paddle, too much brush to portage, so in the morning we began lining the canoe from the shore. Had to chop and saw the brush along the edge of the water. Went back and forth across the river nearly 50 times in one day, looking for room to walk. Traveled only 2 miles that day. River still rising. Could fill the canyon and pull us underwater any minute. Couldn't risk the canoe against the huge current, but finally had no choice. Pressed for time, we pushed it into the current. Our worst mistake so far. Almost fatal. Finally managed to get the canoe ashore, but lost a lot of gear. What didn't sink was quickly swept downstream. Out of food and closer to failure than ever before, we chose to travel all night. Another bad mistake. Darkness and shoreline made portaging clumsy and painful and dangerous. We had to carry the canoe above our heads for miles. anxious to make up for lost time, we put in too soon and we were almost swept backwards over the falls. We were making too many mistakes in country that didn't allow them. Never before had anyone else done what we were doing, and never again could anyone else be the first to do it. But we hadn't really thought about being killed. Almost any other danger was worth the sense of accomplishment. In fact, danger had become a part of the accomplishment itself.
But the Rat River leads to this: the rugged but breathtaking majesty of the McDougall Pass. Phil Pemberton and Tony Mercredi have come to McDougall Pass by plane. They watch the plane depart and make camp to wait for Verlen and Clint to appear. 3 days pass. Then 4. 6. 8. There they are. It has taken them 9.5 days to travel 200 miles, and it's been a tough 200 miles, marked by the most serious accident of the trip to date. The story of that 200 miles is written on Clint's hands and face. He has 55 cuts and abrasions. They managed to retrieve some gear, thoroughly soaked, but lost 4 cameras, a tape recorder, and most of their food. But incredibly, their sense of humor is still functioning. Clint decides to hold the Summit Lake Beauty Contest, even if there's no competition out here. Maybe Verlen would enter if the first prize were a new pair of boots or a new pair of feet. 50 yards from their campsite come 3 magnificent barren ground caribou. Look at the one in the middle, limping. Clint explains that nature takes care of its own in quite miraculous ways. These 3 caribou have separated from the main herd. Wolf packs continually follow the main herd, and these 3 will have a better chance of surviving on their own. The 2 uninjured animals are there to protect and help the wounded caribou. Summit Lake is beautiful indeed, but there is no time for sightseeing. All too soon, the 4 men are back on the waters, ready for a 230-mile push to the next settlement, Old Crow. And Phil and Tony will make the trip too. The first 3 miles seem to go inch by inch, bush by bush. There's no room to paddle. Brush whips into their faces and entangles the canoe. The physical strain is bad enough, but the thought that there are still 1,700 miles to go weighs even more heavily. And then, open water on the Little Bell River. The McDougall Pass has been crossed over this year by only 6 other people. Clint and Verlen climb to a plateau where the caribou herds are passing on their migratory route. The animals are moving south to escape the onset of winter. Our voyageurs are paddling north to meet it head-on. The caribou are moved by instinct. The men are moved by a challenge. The challenge to complete a trip unmatched in recorded history. Winter comes on fast in the bitter north. It's now Saturday, September 11th. Now they are on the Big Bell River, which winds through the Richardson Mountains north of the Arctic Circle.
The peaks are covered by an early snow, a grim warning of what is to come. We must take care so that the majesty of this country does not deceive us. A sudden storm could render these rivers impassable in a matter of hours. Scenery must never take precedence over survival.
The autumn colors, while beautiful, speak of cold weather to come and put an increasing frantic urgency to the question: will they reach the Bering Sea in time? Again, they increase their efforts, paddling over long stretches between rest stops. The sun sets earlier each day, and so they keep right on going into the dusk. They may have to grope in the dark for a campsite, but miles are now more important than comfort. Even the beauty of a Yukon sunset is colored by the race against time. How long before this water is frozen? How much time is left? Other canoeists had called the trip impossible. Were they right? On the Porcupine River, a wolf pack, another ominous sign of approaching winter. And another caribou herd migrating to the lowlands. This one has to climb a bit to continue its journey, and even these animals have trouble negotiating the rugged terrain. Clint and Verlen realize how tough it would be to walk out of this country if frozen streams were to make canoeing impossible. And so ends another long day. At Old Crow, 1,500 miles from the Bering Sea, the morning temperature is 25 degrees above zero, and patches of ice are appearing along the banks of the swift Porcupine River. They're soon off again. Verlen and Clint begin pushing even harder, covering over 265 miles in 2.5 days. The Voyageurs buy fresh supplies in Fort Yukon. And find that civilization has reached this wilderness outpost in the form of the local movie house, the Purple Onion, and the Sardo Inn, the only hotel in town. It's also time for mail call, one of the 4 times the mail catches up with them, and Verlen draws the most letters. With a devoted wife and 9 children back home, how could he lose? Verlen buys new boots with mixed emotions. His feet feel better, but the clerk tells him that at this time last year, the river was frozen.
No one will ever know how many explorers died in silence. The dignity of being buried was denied to many, while some were laid to rest when no one knew their names. This country affords the eye many delights, but the mind must be ever vigilant, for the same scene that astonishes the eye can extinguish life with an indifference that inspires constant fear.
The next morning, the frost is thick on the canoe cover as Verlen and Clint load up their gear. Areas of calm water along the shoreline, though melted now, actually froze during the night. A local guide advises against continuing, and a sense of urgency grows out of the realization that having come this far and worked this hard, they could wake up one morning and find it's all over, that failure has been guaranteed by something over which they have no control. For it's common for the Yukon River to freeze up overnight. Downstream, Verlen and Clint pass an Indian fishing wheel, turning slowly in the current. In the true hospitality of the far north, anyone may help himself to the fish in these wheels at no charge. Verlen and Clint are paddling hard in conditions worse than ever. They cover as much as 85 miles a day in their frantic push northwards. A typical day is September 26th. Verlen writes,
Woke up at 5:30. Some freezing rain last night. Socks frozen again. Breakfast of oatmeal and raisins, hardtack and jam, and hot cocoa. On the water at 7. Cold and wet. Calm for a while, then wind and rain. We saw 4 wolf packs and a small bear. Navigation now more important than ever. One wrong turn down a channel and precious hours could be lost. Dinner, beef noodle soup with rice, hardtack, and hot cocoa. No wrong channels so far, thank God. Clothes soaked from the waist down all day. Stopped early for the night at 7 p.m. Steady rain, cold and wet. Miserable. Tough getting a fire going in the dark. Supper, a good batch of hot pancakes with wheat germ. Made the outlook a lot better. Paddled over 80 miles today.
October 6th. The men are 5 miles out of St. Mary's. For the last 11 days, the two have battled freezing cold and a very heavy northern headwind. St. Mary's is an Eskimo village. Life is simple and hard. The brief summer is past, and the village priest, like everyone else, must scurry about preparing for the rapidly approaching winter. Much of the work of the coming months must be done now, for soon the snow will sporadically paralyze the village until next spring. Wood for heating is a vital item, second in importance only to food. This village still has sled dogs and a full quota of furry pups. Then, with devastating swiftness, it happens. A blizzard blankets St. Mary's, freezing all the village boats right at the shoreline. And somewhere, out on the river, are Clint and Verlen. The Eskimos told them the river could freeze up completely any day now. Verlen's early ice-to-ice description proves true, and they must now search for a place to land the canoe along the shore. Pemberton greets them and advises against going on, but Verlen isn't buying. In a way, there's only an inch to go. On the map, it's just an inch. But on the river, it's 105 miles to the Bering Sea. They listen carefully, then climb back into their canoe. Pemberton rents a powerboat that can handle the Yukon River and sets out after them. But a fierce storm blows up abruptly, and the waves are too much even for a boat of that size. Driven to an island where his boat swamps, he sets up a camera to record his own activities. Pemberton builds a fire on the island and pitches a rough camp. Somewhere ahead of him, and in a narrow canoe, Verlen and Clint face the same weather. They've allowed themselves enough food for only 2 days' travel, but they figure the river will be frozen after that. He adds a last will and testament to his diary and allows himself a small amount of food because he has no idea how long he will remain marooned. As he crawls into his sleeping bag, he has no way of knowing that 4 men have drowned in the same storm, nor has he any way of knowing who they are. Two days later, the winds let up, and Pemberton fashions a bailer out of a gasoline can. The motors have been thoroughly soaked, and there's no way of knowing if either of them will start. He has no idea where Verlen and Clint are, or even if they have survived the furious storm. One motor starts, and Pemberton races back to Mountain Village. Here he can learn only that 4 unidentified men have drowned. An Eskimo seal hunter offers to help him search for Verlen and Clint. They had become separated from Phil on Thursday. It is now Saturday. Behind an alder thicket, in an area where they have hacked out a campsite, Clint and Verlen are preparing for the last 80 miles of their challenge when they are found by Phil and the hunter. They've carefully conserved their food and talk of nothing but reaching the Bering Sea. A freezing 20-mile-an-hour headwind has lowered the chill factor to below zero. Virtually all spray freezes instantly, and ice accumulating all over the canoe adds 150 pounds of weight. But worse yet, makes the craft ride lower in the water and greatly increases the chances of swamping. Verlen writes,
"Pushing hard to reach the end. Nothing else matters now. Good mileage, but tremendous output. Every mile really counts."
They have now traveled 7,000 miles. Anticipation and tension mount with each paddle stroke. They are so close, and yet so far. As the sun sets, they choose to paddle all night to reach the Bering Sea, but it was not to be. In the pitch blackness of the Yukon midnight, they slam bow first into what they feared most, into the only thing that could stop them now, ice, masses of it, floating in the Yukon River. They are camped 19 miles from the Bering Sea and must have enough wind to keep the water from freezing. But a strong headwind from the Bering Sea could make canoeing impossible. They can't help thinking back over all the miles they've come, all the months, all the trials and triumphs. But the final triumph still lies at the mouth of that dark and freezing river. Will they have to walk to the Bering Sea, push the canoe over the ice, carry it along the frozen shore? Of one thing they are certain: they will get there. They've come too far to be stopped this close to the goal. At dawn, they are back in the water.
October 10th. It has happened. We're frozen in. The small channel where we camped overnight is covered with skim ice. Can't even get to the main channel. If we can't get to the main channel, we can't reach the Bering Sea. No choice but to go on. Stop to chop the ice off the canoe. Paddles badly iced up, canoe worse. Getting ready for our last effort. It's now or never.
This strange magnetic pull has become a compulsion now. In a small channel, a freezing crosswind pushes them back once more. Ice begins to cling to the canoe again, now sticking even to the paddle blades. Fear, joy, pain, rage, exhilaration. And suddenly, there are no more riverbanks. They have reached the Bering Sea. It is noon, October 10th, 1971. 176 days and 7,000 miles away from that bright, sunny day in Montreal. A journey never before accomplished. An accomplishment never again the same. They have met the challenge, and their victory shout is a simple telegram to Verlen Kruger's wife.